For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit us online at faith.yale.edu. This episode was made possible in part by the generous support of Blueprint 1543. For more information, visit blueprint1543.org.
Are there moments in which normative discussions of what is a good life that theologians and philosophers engage in, when is it that they could be helpfully informed by psychological science? In theology and philosophy, often the argument for or the justification of particular visions of a flourishing life often make use of psychological claims fairly uncritically. So what do I mean by psychological claims there? I mean claims about, well, how human minds work, how emotions work, how our social relationships work. We then, the theologians, how do we know that they work this way? Well, because some very clever person writing a couple thousand years ago said so. And it kind of fits with our intuitions as well. Like, well, that's a good starting point. But in psych science, we call those hypotheses. We don't call those conclusions.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. To a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We've all heard that one before. But imagine trying to make that work. Imagine, for instance, the visionary builder of a medieval cathedral, building it only with hammer and nails. And there's an analogy coming here. Suppose the cathedral that you're trying to build is nothing less than the human inquiry into the nature of the cosmos and the nature of the God who created them. From the dark matter at the edges of the expanding universe to the recycled space dust that's found its way into the pristine fingernails of a newborn baby. Artfully articulating the nature of reality with nuance, care, saying something true and meaningful about God, people, and thriving in the world that we all share. This task of theology could be just like that extravagant building project. But imagine if the theologian only had one tool. Experimental psychologist Justin Barrett tells a story like this to make a suggestion to theologians, to consider how they might incorporate the tools of science, and psychological science in particular, into the building of their theological cathedral. Justin is a longtime researcher in cognitive science of religion. He's author of a number of books, including Why Would Anyone Believe in God? And Born Believers, The Science of Childhood Religion. And he just edited the Oxford Handbook of the Cognitive Science of Religion. And in 2019, he co-founded Blueprint 1543, an organization that's bringing theologians and scientists together to accelerate better contributions to life's biggest questions. And today, we're launching a series of episodes on For the Life of the World that will explore the tools of psychological sciences that might contribute to a deeper and greater theological understanding of the world, by bringing a science-engaged theology to bear on the most pressing matters for how to live lives worthy of our humanity. Throughout the series, we'll be featuring conversations with psychologists who can offer insightful tools for crafting the cathedral where human knowledge meets divine revelation. And we're starting off with this conversation between Justin Barrett and Miroslav Volf. Thanks for listening today, friends.
Justin, fantastic that you can be on our show here.
I'm really happy to be here.
How do you think that, purposes of human life, the normative question, the normative vision of human life, how do you think it bears upon applied psychology in clinical kinds of settings, from psychology as a science?
Yes, let's talk about psychological science as primarily a descriptive and explanatory enterprise. Explanatory, though, in a particular sort of narrowed scope, right? There's certain types of causal explanations that, there are only certain ones that are kind of part of what we're doing as psychological science. And then just like applying those insights, those descriptive and causal insights to any kind of technology, they can be applied to these human technologies, potentially, including clinical practice, but also in education, in industrial and organizational environments, and lots of different ways, right?
Yeah.
Psychological science which, while certainly going to be carrying certain kinds of values and normative perspectives, is sort of more deliberately focused on, well, how do humans just work? How do we think? What are our feelings like? Can we get a handle on that scientifically? And then let that inform either instrumental or normative types of concerns about the good life. And at least from my perspective, at that point, then it becomes a really good resource for theologians to help shape that discussion of what's a flourishing life, what's the life we're called to do. And psychology is weaker for not being explicit about those types of considerations. The danger I see, and the reason why I think people, especially from particular faith traditions, have felt uncomfortable around psychology and see it as a competing worldview, is that when it comes to a lot of these applications, I think many of those working in psychology have assumed the normative dimension without articulating it clearly and defending it. So there is a presumption about, well, what counts as a good life? And often psychologists don't specify what that means. And if they do, they don't necessarily defend it in a robust sort of way. They just assume it. And psychology as an academic discipline, if we are to trust the sociologists of this sort of thing, is among the most secular of academic disciplines. Depending on who measures it, sometimes the most.
Why do you think that's the case?
Partly it's its history. It was popularized by characters like Sigmund Freud, right, who was not just not religious, he was anti-religious in many respects, right? And B.F. Skinner, similar. So these characters who popularized and captured the public imagination about what psychology could be really were, in some ways, trying to offer an alternative to theological visions of human life. Sure. And that's part of psychology's heritage. There is a tendency among psychologists to, even who think that they're just doing the science side of things, to try to keep ghosts out of the machine and just so any of this sort of religious talk about our spirits, our souls, even our volition sometimes is considered out of bounds. Now that's a sociological kind of observation. It need not be that way. There are plenty of Christians who are very good psychological scientists and are much more deliberate in thinking about how their Christian faith informs doing psychological science. And we've sometimes seen this, especially in recent decades, lead to the development of areas of psychology like positive psychology, where it's hard not to notice once you start getting to know who are the main players in this, that Christians are kind of overrepresented in these domains compared to others. And it's easy to see why, because they're drawing from their own faith traditions around topics like gratitude, forgiveness, hope, that these are really important parts of what it means to be human, and they deserve sort of reasoned treatment by the scientific methods as well.
How do you take the relationship to be between what one can describe explanatory and instrumental reason on the one side, and we've been talking about primarily about the instrumental and explanatory reason, to something like teleological reason, a reason that posits or that deals with the purposes of our lives and of our existence. And sometimes I tend to think that even in theology, a sometimes neglected aspect of theological work has to do with purposes of our lives. And yet, when I read the biblical text, I seem to think that one of the main thrusts of the biblical traditions is to sketch for us purposes, or, and I think in one of the comments that you have made, the intentions of God for the creation, so that the purpose ends up being one of the fundamental distinguishing characteristics of the way in which theologians work. How do purposes of our lives, normative visions, how do they then shape a psychological inquiry from your standpoint? Or do they?
Oh, I certainly think they do. You know, just in terms of living the life of a psychologist, even if my focus is on psychological science, not on necessarily the applied side, I'm going to find myself drawn to particular types of questions and problems because they seem important to me. Yeah. And well, why do they seem important to me? Well, because they're somehow consistent with what I regard as either my personal purpose or the purpose of humans, right? I think there's a lot of focus on pathology, psychopathology, for instance, as a field, because there's a sense that whether it's tacit or well articulated, that, well, when things are going wrong emotionally, when we're not well regulated, when we're not responding to our environment well, we're somehow not living into our purpose as well as we ought to be. Right. So there's definitely teleology baked in. And I guess my encouragement for, my colleagues in the psychological sciences is just to be clearer about that and where that teleological vision is coming from, because often that's just not clear. What's it coming from? A consensus, that some association of psychological science or psychiatric science, for that matter, have determined, quite literally on the basis of some kind of convention where, we vote and decide, okay, this is what it means to live a good life because we voted, and therefore we've arrived at a conclusion. Well, there's something not terribly satisfying about that, it seems to me.
I think that's exactly right. And I think discussion in terms of how do we get at the purposes, right? Because obviously there's an implicit account of purposes that's baked into every definition of the good life. And then the question is, how do we come to those, and whether these are matters for science to determine what kind of contribution science has been, our particular case, psychology, can have in thinking about purposes, or whether there is kind of an indispensable, if you want, leap, so that the purposes of human lives are underdetermined by strict reason, at least the kind of reason that can be justified on scientific grounds. And hence, there is a certain kind of openness to philosophical, religious perspectives that is essential if we are going to think well about the purposes of our lives.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so the critique of especially applied psychologists who are sort of smuggling in, or maybe slithering in, I'm not sure which verb is right here, but some kind of view of what the good life is without carefully scrutinizing that is a fair critique of psychology. There is, of course, the other side of this. And that is, well, are there moments in which normative discussions of what is a good life that theologians and philosophers engage in, when is it that they could be helpfully informed by psychological science? And I think there are those moments too, where often, at least I read in theology and philosophy, often at least the argument for or the justification of particular visions of a flourishing life often make use of psychological claims fairly uncritically.
Yeah.
So what do I mean by psychological claims there? I mean claims about, well, how human minds work, how emotions work, how our social relationships work. And how do we know, we then, the theologians, how do we know that they work this way? Well, because some very clever person writing a couple thousand years ago said so. And it kind of fits with our intuitions as well. Like, well, that's a good starting point. But in psych science, we call those hypotheses. We don't call those conclusions. I guess my question back is, when are those moments in theological inquiry on the normative project where the psych science can actually be useful?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very helpful question to pursue. And the kind of 4 questions that you have in some of your writings identified as central questions seem to me something that I, as a theologian, would certainly always want to keep in forefront of my mind. I want to know whether some claims that I'm making, whether they make sense. So, for instance, in the book I did on memory, and here I am completely jumped into the field with some knowledge, but not extensive in psychology. And so I have said something, but then in retrospect or in prospect, hopefully, I would want to know whether that makes sense. Does it make sense that sometimes experiences we have had in the past, where we remember them, allow somehow past to colonize our future, and that we drive our lives by looking in the rearview mirror and the effects that might have on our lives? That seems to me, when I make it, it's a kind of commonsensical with a little bit of reading of the situation. But that would be really important to know whether that can stand the scrutiny of careful examination, how actually those painful events in our memory, under what condition, how they impact us, and under what conditions. So that's where I would say, open those books, do those research, Mr. Theologian, and learn what needs to be learned.
Yeah, I've for several years been involved with a project where we call it the TheoPsych project, a project where we've been trying to introduce psychological science to theologians and vice versa, not so that they will become psychologists, but so that they've got another tool in their belt in doing theology. Theologians have lots of disciplinary tools at their disposal. They're kind of the ultimate interdisciplinarians, I think. At least they could be, right? Because they know a little bit about philosophy and textual studies and history and linguistics and sometimes anthropology and archaeology and all kinds of things. I thought, well, psychology is another good tool for the belt. So the first one is the theologian making what you might call just descriptive claims about how human minds work? And you might think that's not what theologians do. Well, except that it turns out they do it quite a bit. There is that descriptive phase of theology that has to make certain claims about the lived world out there that people are in, especially in areas like pastoral and other areas of practical theology, but in theological anthropology as well. There are lots of claims about, well, what's the nature of a human? What are its features? What does rationality look like? Well, what's the role of language in human thought? I mean, there are all kinds of claims that theologians are tempted to make that have at least a psychological component, if they aren't just sort of bread and butter psychological topics in some respect. And many theologians doing that have drawn upon the psychology of the times to do that, even fairly explicitly. But we don't see that, I don't think, as much in contemporary theology, drawing on contemporary psychological science, as much as maybe the ancients did, where the division amongst the disciplines was much more collapsed, right? Where they were all some types of each other. So that's that descriptive. The second question was, are you making a normative claim? Are you making a claim about how things ought to be, what you ought to be doing? What is the good life? And using descriptive claims as evidence or support for that argument. So then the third question is, I see in theological texts often claims about, for instance, what the sacraments do to people, to individuals and the community, or what prayer does, or what worship does. And that's often the language, is as if there's this thing, worship, and then it has these consequences. It does these things. It's almost agentified. It's personified in some ways. It need not be. Sometimes it's just, it's again offered as a description of a causal sort of relationship between certain kinds of actions or a text and what it does. And then finally, the fourth question was, in constructing a theological argument, are you relying on intuitions that there's sort of there's a sub point in here that you take to be representative of sort of general people's intuitions? And here, I guess I'm leading into the insights that that has controversially sort of swept some areas of philosophy, especially through what's known as experimental philosophy. Experimental philosophers have started re-examining the intuitions of philosophers to see, well, are they as universal as the philosophers lead us to believe? Because they often take, well, it seems that, as very strong premises that play important roles in their argument structures. And, well, what if it doesn't seem that, X or P? What if that doesn't seem to be the case, or that seeming, more interestingly, is importantly conditioned by things that really shouldn't matter to the argument? So it's not just, okay, because philosophers know, not very careful thinkers, not very educated people can have wrong seemings. Their intuitions might not be properly tuned. Okay, yeah, but what if it's not education that's or sort of intellect that's at play, but it's your cultural condition that's at play? And suddenly your seemings are very different just because you're from a different cultural environment, not a different intellectual sort of strength. Well, that might make us re-examine those intuitions that we're using as premises. And insofar as that applies to philosophical kinds of arguments, it seems to me that it could apply to theological ones as well. So we might think there is an analog to experimental philosophy that you might call experimental theology that could be developed that actually sort of looks at theologians' intuitions and see, well, are those intuitions, are they of the right sort that we should put so much confidence in them? So those are the 4 questions: description, normative claims that are supported by description, effects, and then arguing from intuitions. But maybe there are more. Maybe I've missed some of them.
That's enough for us poor theologians to catch up on. You've got us going in terms of what the kind of work we need to do, or at least kinds of friends we need to keep, so that we can kind of touch base and figure out. Because I think increasingly theology is becoming, as other disciplines, also a collaborative science, and collaborative not just within the field itself, but also across the field. And my sense is that we increasingly have to be that, because we can no longer be the kinds of generalists that people could be in previous centuries, given the exponential growth of knowledge, and hence the collaboration with other theology and other sciences is vital for some of the reasons that you describe. I think we'd have to look very carefully in the specifics of things. I mean, I've already illustrated a bit about making descriptive psychological claims, which I think we often do, especially those of us, maybe less folks who work strictly in dogmatic theology, but especially those of us who work kind of on the intersection between life practices and life as it is lived and theology, which I personally, of course, some of my colleagues will disagree with me, but I personally think that it is the most important kind of edge of theology, because that's how I read biblical traditions, biblical texts. And for those of us, conversation with sociology, anthropology, psychology, those end up being really, really significant. You know, the kinds of things that come to mind to me when I think about those things and where one might want to push back, and I'm sure that's not just theological kind of a pushback, is, to ask the question, well, sure, it's possible for theology to be captive to the particular set of cultural presuppositions, but psychology and a lot of psychological work that I've seen is captive to maybe slightly different group, but nonetheless within a single culture, and not just within a single culture, within the particular subsection of that culture. Now, that's not a pushback against psychology, quasi-psychology. It's maybe just wanting more clarity about the nature of the method used and what kind of conclusions can be made for that. Or in terms of the effects, for instance, of text versus or effects of some of the psychological, more clinical level, but also that can be experimentally significant. For instance, there's a lot of work talk about, and I think, Justin, you mentioned that, about kind of responding well to the environment. Now, that would really need to be very carefully spelled out, because responding well to the environment will be well in interest of whom. What kind of environment, as if environment was simply kind of the given of natural given, as if environment was not highly culturally inflected, so that certain kind of attunement to the environment may be misattunement to the fundamental character of who human beings are, so that creating happy citizens may be not in interest of those citizens, but in interest some kind of forces in society that are pushing precisely for that are crafting a whole discipline so that it can serve the purposes of creating a docile citizens who don't feel the pain so much of the things that are being inflicted upon them. So issues of that sort can be asked, and they're not necessarily simply privilege of theologians to ask them. Psychologists, I'm sure, are asking them, and philosophers are asking those questions themselves as well. And I mean, that would be, for me as a theologian, interesting to know, and how then to draw on psychological science. And finally, where the line to kind of a strict normativity is crossed, because that's being blurred very often, as you mentioned just at the very beginning, especially with the great founders of psychological science.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't disagree with anything that you've said there. Psychology needs to do its own inspecting. I mean, and I think that's where we started, is that psychology often, again, especially, well, all of it, the sort of psychological science, as well as the sort of practical side, is sort of bringing in certain kinds of normative commitments, often less examined than it ought to be. So definitely that's true. And the point about it being culturally conditioned, absolutely true. I think where there's a little bit of a difference here is that, at least as I see it, and certainly how I've been taught psychological science, is the science of psychology has a great self-awareness of how we can't trust ourselves. The entire method is built around, to put in theological terms, a great conviction about total depravity. In that we can't trust any individual psychologist to actually get the story right, which is why we don't, even though in the beginning of psychology, we relied a lot on introspection. And, it was much more an extension of philosophy of the time. But we've moved away from those methods because we've learned they don't work very well. They're not very reliable. And we've created what you might think of as a distributed epistemology, right? That's based on the idea that you can't trust me as a psychological scientist, and you shouldn't trust me. You must force me, first of all, to gather data, which means I'm going to be bringing in input from other people necessarily. And how I gather the data, I need to be able to articulate to you at least I should, with enough clarity that then you can go and check my work behind me to make sure you get the same results I do. I take it that kind of methodological, we think of it as rigor, but sort of, exercise is something that's different about the sciences compared to most of the humanities disciplines, where there isn't that same type of expectation. And so in some ways, it does protect us from some, even if not all, of the accusation of, but you're culturally situated. Yeah, and I know that. And that's why you don't trust me. You trust sort of the collective, first of all. And second, and that's why I gather data. So if my impression is, people think the following way, that's not good enough. Now I go out and I check it with lots of people thinking that way. And ideally, I do it across cultures. I do it developmentally. I do it under different conditions. And then I draw a conclusion about what people's intuitions are, or how they think, or how their memory systems work. So I don't rely as heavily on either my experiences or authority sources, right? So that's one of the differences. It's a difference in emphasis. It's not a difference in kind, I think. We often pretend it's a difference in kind, but I think it's more a difference in emphasis. So
psychology shares that with other sciences, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Kind of experimental method that is designed for a certain kind of incremental increase of knowledge.
That's right.
And mistakes are also, if they are traceable, identifiable, as good as non-mistakes in a certain sense, because one learns and progresses.
That's right. Yeah, in fact, I saw support for this view in your book, For the Life of the World, right? And I think you're reflecting on some of Paul's writings with regard to just how badly we know ourselves, how even our own internal lives are not accessible to ourselves. And I went, oh, wow, absolutely. That's a psychologically astute observation, right? We don't know ourselves well. So we need these other methods out there to even get at ourselves.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think also for a number of things that I would want to say as a theologian, I feel like I'm constrained from saying them because I have a simple intuition. But I would like that intuition either confirmed or disconfirmed. Just to give you an example, I'm interested in this one claim by Ludwig Wittgenstein, who said the world of a happy man is not the same as the world of a sad man. And the point that he's making is not that the objective state of affairs in the world is not the same for one as it is for the other. The point is rather that I think that the perception of the world, how I experience the world, is always subjectively mediated to me. And perception has both kind of the objective side of registering, but also interpretative side of reading it as something where it makes itself accessible and available to me. And at that juncture, it would seem to me that affective states shape the way in which we perceive the world. And I was then thinking, well, my goodness, that must have then also implications. If you consider the world as a creation, as a gift from God, you ought to be seeing it slightly differently than somebody else who sees it as a nexus of causal relations. Or I was thinking, this is the example that I used writing about the Gospel of John. There's this famous scene in John's Gospel where Mary breaks this jar of precious alabaster oil and anoints Jesus' feet with it. And then Judas is completely incensed that this year's worth of precious substance has been squandered on Jesus' feet, whereas Jesus seems to affirm this as a beautiful act that she has done. And then I make a claim there, which I hope is right. And I don't know. This is the intuition. Conclusion, maybe partly philosophical, partly theological, but certainly not sufficiently psychologically motivated and researched from my perspective. And the claim is that the smell of this precious nard as wasted is a different smell than the smell appreciated as a beautiful work, right? Though for the third party, it would be the same smell. Yet when it's being smelled and it's being experienced, that it's refracted to our own state of relationship to this particular portion of the world, and that is different. And to me, that is just a very small window into how the way in which we, as Christians, learn to read the world on account of the revelation that we encounter who Jesus Christ is, shapes the way in which the world is experienced. Now, I want to know whether that's right or wrong. And the only way for me to know it is to talk to people, or for people to do research on something of that sort.
Well, I think I've got good news for you, and that is, at least it sounds plausible, psychologically plausible. And psychology has resources from a couple of different angles on this. One is the perception field, where there is a fair consensus at this point that we know that what we perceive in the world around us really is shaped by our expectations. What we expect to see is, we sometimes talk about top-down influences, or sometimes they use the language of priors, and other kinds of expectations really do shape what we perceive. And so it's entirely plausible that by coming in with a different conceptual frame, you experience even things like odors in a different way. And there are plenty of demonstrations that this is the case, right? Food experts and wine tasters, because they've built up certain kinds of expectations and expertise, they actually experience these things differently. There are sort of trivial examples of this too, sound like trivial. For me, they're important, like my wife is allergic to hazelnuts. And so the smell of hazelnuts is not a pleasant aroma to me because I know it's poison to my wife.
Right. There we go.
But I've had to learn that, right? And so, no, it's a negative thing, even though for a lot of people it's a positive thing. And for me, it used to be a positive thing, but now it's negative because it carries very different meanings. So I think you're on safe ground. Perception science will get us there. And also state-dependent memories will get us there. So a lot of our memories and all this other information processing is emotionally laden, and we're more likely to attend to features of information that's mood congruent, we will sometimes say. So the depressed person pays more attention to reasons to be depressed. Right. So I think you're on safe ground there. Now I want to see somebody go out and run the experiment, because that would be really cool.
That would be cool.
That would be great.
I'm pretty pleased so far.
Yeah, no, that sounds really great. And look, I think this is a good example of the point I tried to make with the 4 questions and with this encouragement of theologians is not to try to get theologians to become psychologists. I think that's an unfair expectation. You all have a big enough job. I've tried to encourage theologians more to do what theologians do really well, and that is, I sometimes have used the metaphor of being like the master builder at a building site, building a cathedral or something like that. And you have all of these specialists who you bring in at the right time to do the right job. You don't have to be an expert masonry worker or a finished carpenter or whatever, fine skilled craftsman. What you need is a big vision and an understanding of what these different craftsmen do, what they do well, and what their limitations are. And then you can bring them onto your building site. So I think there's an asymmetry here. We often, because we're very kind of collegial type people in the environment we work in. Well, there's the psychology side and the theology side. Like, no. Theology gets all the sides. And psychology has a space within that. It's a reductive discipline necessarily. That's its strength. And I don't think that psychologists need to be ashamed of that. It's necessarily reductive, and that's okay. Theology is not reductive. It's expansive. It can put all of the pieces together, and we need people who do that job well. And part of my encouragement for theologians as part of doing that job well is to know what craftsmen are available to you that you can bring in to do these specialty jobs, maybe better than you can do, because they sure can't do the big job you're doing. And that frees you up to do that broader, normative, descriptive, and instrumental kind of job, hitting all of those things all at the same time. So I hope that takes the pressure off of the theologian for feeling like they need to know all of these areas. Now they just need to know about these areas and the tools that are available to them to be able to synthesize them. But I think you're probably right when you're leaning towards this is going to take collaboration and it's going to require more scientists of various sorts, especially psychological scientists in this context, to step up, to at least become more theologically conversant so that they can engage with theologians and they can sort of understand what is the grand project and then what's my place in it.
And I think if one takes a definition of a theologian in a more broad sense and not simply as academic theologian, because in some ways I think of every Christian is a theologian because theology accompanies the life and situatedness of each individual in the world. So it's a kind of thinking side of the Christian life. And I think once one thinks of it in those terms, one might then also give more weight to psychologists as lay theologians as well, so that then the entirety of the directionality may not need to come from academic theologians, right? Though they may have some significant expertise, and then the endeavor ends up being slightly even more collaborative. And it seems to me that that's really important also for those, say, psychology, other sciences, to be well done internally, right? Because because as you have mentioned early in our discussion, all sorts of sets of values determine how you're going to approach that, even though the experiments themselves tend to be what the experiments are, and the intentionality of them is what it tends to be, as you've also described.
So what I'm hearing is you're saying I can be a theologian too.
Not can. You are.
I are. Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, then, I look forward to that honorary degree from Yale Divinity School. No, I'm with you. I think that's right. And I guess that's part of my encouragement for other human scientists. It's to go ahead and, with appropriate humility, step into those roles.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think we just started, and I think it's a very important, for the sake of the well-being and flourishing of our world, to have these kinds of conversations. And I would say selfishly from the perspective of our own discipline that needs to be enriched by the deep wisdom that can be had from folks like you, Justin. Thank you.
Oh, it's great to be here, and thanks for having me. I hope that this is the first of many such conversations.
The World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured experimental psychologist Justin Barrett and theologian Miroslav Volf. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edit and produce the show. Special thanks to our friends at Blueprint 1543. Visit blueprint1543.org for more information on how theology might engage the sciences. And for more information on the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, visit us online at faith.yale.edu, where you can find past episodes, articles, books, and other educational resources that help people envision and pursue lives worthy of our humanity. So thank you for listening today, and we'll be back with more soon.